How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylei Hobby Time. The other day I was at my local hobby store and I saw these expansion sets for Star Wars Legion, which gave me some inspiration to recreate a Geonosis battle scene in miniature form. Just like hot dogs and hot dog buns, these sets came in unequal amounts. I suppose it's probably because they are two different types of army expansions. The 7 clones came in baggies while the 4 droids came on sprues. I remember when the Phantom Menace came out, LEGO released a Technic B1 battle droid, and I thought the backpack with the antennas on it was the coolest thing in the entire world. Come to think of it, it's probably why I have such a strong affinity for things with random antennas. Once I had removed the clones from their baggies and the droids from their sprues, I assembled everyone. I started with the clones, and due to their thickness, these boys were very easy to put together. As for the fiddly little B1 battle droids, those were pretty messy and they took quite a bit of extra time. Luckily, I could just make a snappy cut and skip to the finished droids.
Roger.
I wanted this diorama to be a little slice of the Battle of Geonosis that would fit nicely on a shelf, wide and shallow, with millions of little blaster bolts flying around. I broke into my LED box and I pulled out some red and blue filaments. For the base itself, I bought some strips of wood. I measured those out and I cut them to length off camera on my bandsaw. Once the sides were cut, I glued them together and I made sure that they were at all right angles using a speed square. I added some additional supports to the middle. Given the way I made the frame, there was plenty of room for a AA battery housing to fit inside, which is what I'm going to be using to power my multitude of little filaments. For a hardtop that would be easier to work with later, I scored and snapped an acrylic sheet. Using the nice clear plastic made things a lot easier when it came to wiring things later on. It's hard to tell, but I did glue the acrylic to the wooden base using some super glue, which does tend to cloud up acrylic, so I wouldn't recommend that in the future, but I'm going to be painting everything anyways, so it didn't really matter. The way I wired this display is the same way I've wired a few projects in the past, including this one and this one. With those projects, however, I did have to take a light bulb, break it, and harvest the little filaments from the insides like egg yolks. Since then, I have switched entirely to using these 3-volt filaments that I found online. They are far easier and safer to work with. I'll drop a link to those below. The filaments will be held up on little wires that stick through the bottom of the base and supply the filaments with power as well. First, I had to figure out where the people were in order to make the realistic paths for the blaster bolts to travel. I used a permanent marker to draw lines downrange from each of the figures and added a little arrow to remember which side it was coming from. I'll add a little white background here so you guys can see it better. I marked 2 points on each line spaced out exactly the length of a filament, and I drilled the holes on each point with my pin vise. I used a bit that was exactly the same size as the wire so that everything would have a nice snug fit later. The wire I'm using is 22 gauge enameled copper wire, so I had to scrape off the coating in a few places to allow the solder to bond to it. I then bent the wires, ran them through the holes, and I glued them in place. I then connected all of the positive leads to each other and all of the negative leads to each other to create a parallel circuit. Then ran the negative wire straight to the battery, and the positive wire I ran through a toggle switch. And I'm not really sure why I put the toggle switch where I did, but I did. And that's where it ended up. I tested my circuit, as one often should, and I masked off the ends of each of the exposed wires with masking tape. And I took the base outside to prime. This round of primer will help hold the terrain paste better than the acrylic would have on its own. To make the terrain paste, I mixed up some plaster, Mod Podge, and water to the consistency of cream cheese, and I spread it over the whole base. I also used some leftover plaster rocks from a previous build to create a little bit more variety and visual interest on the base. After the rocks had been glued down and blended in with more plaster, I sprinkled on some texture in the form of pebbles, medium sand, small sand, and smaller sand. I added isopropyl alcohol to break up the surface tension, help my watered down glue mixture spread out and get full coverage over all of the sand. After the rocks and sand were thoroughly covered with glue and isopropyl alcohol, I left it overnight to dry fully. I came back to it the next day and I primed it for painting. I also primed all of the little figures as well. As you can imagine, painting clones is relatively straightforward. Most of them is white, with a few little trim pieces of black on the helmet and black between all of the plates of armor. I was trying to decide what other colors to add to this commander, and I know my friend Ashton really likes Commander Fox, so I gave him Fox's colors. This clone is missing a few things like a visor and pistols that Fox should have, but hopefully the paint job got it close enough. On Geonosis, the battle droids are painted a slightly more reddish hue than their off-world counterparts, so after a gray primer coat, I covered them with a rust color that I stole from build making stuff. Luckily, he won't notice because he doesn't really watch my Star Wars builds. I then painted the rest of the clones off camera. They were black and white, and one was red all over, like a newspaper. Then I moved on to the base. I started with the same rust wash that I used for those droids, and I splotched it on with a black ink as well to create a natural looking blend across the surface. I finished it up with a dusty dry brush to complete my attempt at that Geonosis look. I then cleaned up the sides with black 3.0 and I removed all of the masking tape from the wires. I then soldered my red and blue 3-volt blaster bolt LED filaments onto their respective leads. The very last thing to do was to add the clones and the B1 battle droids into position. After that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are great. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.